Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at an optimized Valby progression guide. Note that all gameplay showcased is done with 1 energy activator per weapon and Descendant, and absolutely 0 crystallization catalysts anywhere on the loadout. I've done the math for the optimized builds to slot on and will give further advice on what a full build should look like. In other words, all gameplay achieved and shown today is free to play friendly, as I myself am going through a farm only playthrough. Yes, everything I showcased I farmed out myself. This is also why guides will take slightly longer to publish, due to planning, farming, and spreadsheets required. There is an important spreadsheet regarding Valby's supply moisture skill module in the description and pinned regarding different weapons. You'll know why it's there later. First, we're going to be taking a look at Valby's playstyles and kit. Then we'll be looking at her skill modules available. Then finally, different build setups. This will include the modding, reactor choice, and also external components. Finally, weapon choices will be discussed, as well as how unusual scaling mechanics affect weapon modding on Valby. Now, Valby is one of the few Descendants that have movement speed buffs. Perhaps that's why I liked her so much, alongside Viessa and Bunny as well. She's an all-rounder, focusing on offensive support and with skill modules, proper weapon platform DPS that can come close to rivaling other DPS Descendants, and a decent ability DPS option. If you're looking for a Descendant that has a little bit of everything, but has options to optimize for specific kinds of content, Valby is a good choice. She doesn't even need catalysts. Note that she leans more heavily towards weapon platform setups and are also lower investment than ability DPS. She is comfortable and easy to play, and most importantly is the only Descendant currently that can completely ignore body blocking. As a bonus, you get her signature weapon, the legendary Thunder Cage, for free, from just doing normal gameplay progression. Let's break down her kit. We'll discuss her passive first because it's extremely important to her. By default, standing on any kind of water, including her own abilities, makes her skills cost 30% less mana to cast. This is additive to skill cost mods and not multiplicative. More importantly, Valby has access to a unique laundry debuff that applies whenever you damage an enemy with anything on her kit. Honestly, this should be listed on her passive. Now, it lasts 20 seconds by default, scaling by duration, and decreases enemy resistance to electric and non-attribute damage by 20%, unaffected by strength. Note that this is an enemy debuff, meaning your entire team benefits from this. Yes, Valby and Bunny go perfect together because Valby buffs her damage. There are also other skill modules that change how her passive works, which I'll get into later. Her first skill throws a bouncy bubble that has not very good aim at enemies and also doesn't fully respect map topography. However, it is very good at just spreading water all over the place in front of you without needing to move. Perfect for her passive. It actually has moderately high motion values at 469.5% by default, but it explodes on contact with enemies. It's basically a one and done deal. You'll more often be using this to spread pools of water for your passive, but is a solid get out of jail free card to kill fodder. All lingering pools of water from any of her skills will deal damage over time to any enemy standing on them as well. Her second skill is a teleport that produces a massive water pool at the place you come from and the place where you end up. Note that casting this has a full body animation lock with 0 iframe, so do not cast this in the middle of a crowd in hard mode. Getting out of danger is done much better with her first and third skill and not this one. Now, this ability is mainly useful for just repositioning quickly or on elevations, since her third ability cannot jump. You normally will not be using this ability much due to lengthy animation time and little benefits. Her third skill is the bread and butter for her mobility, utility, and survivability. However, note that you cannot jump or use weapons while in this state. Cleanup grants her body blocking immunity for getting out of bad situations. It also grants her a massive speed buff that is only slightly slower than Bunny's ability sprint and spreads pools of waters while also having 50% damage reduction. This is really good for already having water pools where you end up when you need to set up DPS quickly, such as repositioning in Colossi fights. Her fourth skill and its base functionality is somewhat bugged. It is supposed to suck enemies up nearby, not scaling with range, but sometimes it just fails to do so. Anyways, all it does is produce a vortex to drag enemies into. This is best used in dungeons for door camping mechanics or neutralizing a spawn point. It is not that useful in overworld, since the suck radius does not scale with range. There's also a somewhat long animation to pull out a water cannon before he can use it and can prove unwieldy. So let's look at Valby's skill modules next, as they drastically alter her kit and are the main reasons to play her. Water play is the first but weird one. Now it changes your first skill from a bouncy ball to a line of water in front of you. There are a few things to know about this. It does not respect elevation and can easily get blocked by obstacles. Whereas the base ability does not bounce that high, it is able to bounce around obstacles quite often. On a weapon platform build, the reduced range compared to how far the bouncy ball travels makes water play moderately useful for close quarters combat, but useless for medium to long range engagements, like against Colossi. There's also a much better weapon platform skill module I'll discuss later. For an ability DPS build, it actually has decent damage but requires extensive modding to make it worthwhile on hard mode. You'll want a lot of range and a lot of skill power to cover as big a hitbox as possible per cast. Tidal Wave is the skill module for her third ability, Clean Up. This removes the water trail you leave behind and instead now deals collision damage when you pass through enemies. There's no limit to how many times you can collide, so you can do some crazy mouse spinning strats for super high damage on small groups of enemies. But that can be awkward. Now, while this augment buffs the base duration of her movement skill from base 5 to 8 seconds and can hit multiple times, it leaves a little bit to be desired in the damage department unless you're going max investment. It is half the DPS scaling of her first skill, therefore in low investment builds, you're required to spin your mouse around to deal super high damage to enemies several times. For fodder though, I can generally want to shot them comfortably at low investment. At high investment, this module is actually very solid for the cast cost and duration and can one-shot the vast majority of things in the game, versus the amount of damage you can put out. This skill module is completely useless for weapon platform builds because you no longer produce water trails when in her third ability. Now, Moisture Supply is the skill module for her passive. This is the only skill module you'll be using on weapon platform builds, and on max investment is the preferred one for ability DPS builds. It gives skill crit rate, which most of the time doesn't matter, skill duration, which is nice, and status chance on your weapon, but your passive no longer gives cheaper cast costs on water. What it doesn't say is that it also gives a massive crit rate buff to your weapon. How massive? On most weapons, like scout rifles, assault rifles, and SMGs, it doubles your final crit chance. Yes, doubles. And your final crit, not mod crit. No, it's not just a visual bug, we tested this. So you see this 35% crit rate Thunder Cage? Yeah, so I use Supply Moisture and stand on my water. It now has 70% crit rate while still debuffing enemies to take more damage from electric. But there are exceptions to this. On certain weapons, like the Tamer, it triples their final crit chance instead. Yes, triple. You know that beast of a meta gun everyone is using? Tamer, but only with base 10% crit? And how you mod it plus substats up to about 22 to 25% final crit rate only? Yeah, with this augment, that is now a 65 to 70% crit rate Tamer, which massively spikes its DPS. This skill module is what makes Valby a boss-killing machine and an actually good weapon platform, because she has absolutely zero issues spreading water everywhere. You're basically playing Splatoon in boss fights. For snipers, this augment works a bit different. It gives 44% of the total crit chance present after mods. This means any sniper can hit 100% crit with just one crit rate mod instead of two, freeing up the slot for more weak point or more crit damage, bigger mag, reload. The possibilities are endless. It also allows the Afterglow sword legendary sniper to reach 90% crit rate without using any crit rate mods at all because of its passive, freeing up even more mod slots. The easiest way to use the Moisture Supply augment is just aim your one at an enemy, and you'll already spawn a puddle on top of yourself. This will give you the crit buffs while also applying laundry debuff to the enemy for more electric DPS. I'll be slowly updating the spreadsheet with more weapon testing to see how the bonus crit rate scales on other weapons used by Valby. Currently at the time of writing, Thunder Cage, Silly Weeper, Tamer, and Belief are the only weapons listed there. Valby's final skill module is Singeing Water. Now this is pretty simple. Your ult now spawns a taunt instead of a short-lived suck. There are only two outcomes for this, as I do not own it. During the beta, this taunt had HP, meaning it could be destroyed by enemies, and on hard mode it gets nearly one-shot. So that would make this skill module useless. Now if they ever fix this on live servers so that the taunt doesn't have HP, then this can be useful. However, because it needs to compete with Moisture Supply for weapon platform setups, and Water Play and Tidal Wave for lower investment ability DPS setups, and also Moisture Supply for max investment ability DPS setups, there really is no use for this augment, except for pure crowd control utility and harder infiltrations when playing as a full team. Okay, it is time to look at Valby builds. As a reminder, all Valby setups will start as one energy activator, but 0 crystallization catalysts. These are min-max modding options based off the capacity limitations I enforced. I'll give advice on how to further improve the build if you invest more catalysts, but personally I'd recommend waiting until Ultimate Valby comes next month. First, we'll be looking at the weapon platform setups, which is generally more effective, easier to play, and performs better at low investment. There are some nuances between the dungeon rushing and bounty clearing setups versus the Colossi boss killer setup, so let's look at the bounty setup first. For both weapon setups today, we of course start with Supply Moisture. Racking up skill modules does not improve their effects, but reduces the capacity consumed by equipping them. Mine was max rank for this build because I wanted the most I could get out of my mods, but you can leave it at rank 8, which only costs 2 million gold overall, instead of the 5 million needed to go from rank 0 to 10. But note that you will have to drop 2 capacity somewhere. Personally, if you do that, I would recommend lowering ranks on maximized range because that's the only mod you can kind of drop without causing problems. Because all your damage comes from weapons, and our buffs and debuffs do not scale with strength, everything skill power related is a dump stat. This lets us easily run the maximized mods for range and duration with 0 penalty. We double stack MB conversion with Nimble Fingers to cut our movement skill cooldown to just 6.9 seconds, matching the 7 seconds duration. This lets you have infinite uptime on your mobility skill, provided you have energy for it. Depending on the content you play, you can either use Maximized Conservation or MP Collector in this slot. MP Collector is better for any content where you expect to get a lot of kills, whereas Maximized Conservation works better for speedrunning through dungeons that require a lot of parkour and travel time between encounters. Finally, we slot the mandatory HP and defense, so we aren't paper thin. If you choose to put further catalysts into Valby in the future, especially when our ultimate variant drops next month with extra socket polarities, then you would want to double stack MP Collector with Maximized Conservation to guarantee you have infinite energy at all times. Improved Drive Shaft or Accelerated Drive Shaft for more fire rate or firearm attack can fill the other slot. Passionate Sponsor does not proc off of Valby buffing herself with Supply Moisture, and she cannot buff teammates to activate it either. The final slot can be anything tanking related with bonus stats, like Battle of Stamina, or Elemental Resistance if needed in harder content. For the bossing setup, the overall idea is the same, with some tweaks. Colossi are easy to tag with your 1, so you no longer need range as it also spawns your puddle on top of you. There were much less enemies to kill in Colossi fights, so we opted to drop MP Collector completely for more tanking, Spear and Shield. If you can't fit this, that's fine too, as you wouldn't be able to level it much. If it's an elemental dot type of boss, you could slot in an unranked matching status immunity mod, such as Insulated Conductor or Perfect Anti-Venom. Skill cooldown also isn't as needed because you don't run around as much in Colossi fights versus overworld bounties and dungeon clearing. A single cooldown mod is enough for good uptime on your mobility skills so long as your reactor also has cooldown substats. Instead, we slot elemental resistance to the appropriate element so we don't die. We still want higher duration so our mobility skill in puddles lasts longer. Skill power once again is irrelevant on this setup since all our damage comes from weapons and Supply Moisture buffs do not scale with skill power. For higher investment builds with more catalysts, especially when Ultimate Valby drops next month, you would once again slot Improved Drive Shaft or Accelerated Drive Shaft for more fire rate or firearm attack %. A second skill cost reduction mod in another empty slot will give you more leeway on puddle cast uptime in fights, and the last flex slot can be spent on literally anything. Passionate Sponsor even works if you need to revive teammates, but the last slot is a true flex slot on the boss setup. Absolute Curse can easily fit in here if the Colossi self-buffs so that you can rip parts off and dispel. Now, for the ability DPS setup, you have two main options. You either use Water Play or Tidal Wave at low investment. I'll explain the high investment build later. Both of them follow the same rules. You want cheaper casts and shorter cooldowns. This allows you to spam DPS more often. Note that Tidal Wave extends your mobility DPS skill to base 8 seconds duration instead of 5. Using both purple focus mods minimizes our cooldown to just 10 seconds. We don't want to mod duration because it doesn't affect water play DPS builds and the 8 seconds duration on Tidal Wave casts is already enough. The skill modifier penalty for maximized conservation is only a 6% DPS loss overall, so don't worry about it. I'll be making a guide on how all versions of skill power terms math out in the future because it's actually confusing and I don't want to explain it here. If you're using water play builds, you will also have to mod range to make the hitbox of the water pool bigger. The problem is we don't really have mod capacity to do this. Dropping any mod on this build makes it significantly worse, which is why I recommend using Tidal Wave on zero catalyst builds only. At higher investment than nothing, water play builds can obviously slot a range mod. You will also slot non-attribute Synxidium for 10% more non-attribute skill power. This will be about 6% total damage increase. Dangerous Ambush is strongly recommended if playing in a team, but useless if solo Valby. For solo Valby, you can use Decimator instead, as in squads, she normally cannot keep up with a Freyna or Bunny nuking in AoE. Preemptive Strike can also work if you don't want to deal with managing timer buffs and awkward stat conditions being in a team or solo. Valby has only base 5% base skill crit, so it is not worth modding skill crit on her when using water play or tidal wave skill modules. Now though, on the other hand, if you go max investment, I would wait until ultimate Valby. But in max investment, Supply Moisture again is the better ability DPS option. This only works at maximum investment with multiple crystallization catalysts because you have to use all the mods I mentioned earlier but now also slot in skill crit rate and crit damage mods. Supply Moisture multiplies her final crit chance by 5, but realistically, because her base crit is 5%, it's difficult to make this work on lower investment, which is why I said so earlier. You can't get her base crit higher than about 12.5% with all available sources in play. This comes from maxing out the Skill Insight mod for plus 115% and rolling a gold skill crit on your gold reactor for plus 35%. At 12.5% overall crit rate, Supply Moisture skyrockets this to 62.5 ability crit rate. Even if you don't have skill crit on your reactor, she will still reach about 50 to 55% ability crit rate. A max skill concentration buffs her skill crit damage from 1.3 to 2.8 times. Luckily, the actual build is the same as Water Play and Tidal Wave, you just add in the crit mods too. For a maximum investment Valby, Supply Moisture ability DPS is superior to Water Play and Tidal Wave. Okay, so let's talk about her reactor choices next. Obviously, she wants a non-attribute reactor. At the time of posting this video, you can farm all you want for Valby at Sterile Lands, Ambush Point on hard mode. Currently, for the next week, this zone drops non-attribute reactors with Dimension main stat bonus and white ammo, which is general ammo, optimization condition, aka Thunder Cage. Perfect for all Valby builds, since Weapon Platform Valby does not care about the subtype main stat. I use this particular reactor for all Valby builds today, though it can be min-maxed for specific variants more. I'll be listing all the viable substats first and then more build-specific substat combinations if there's a Valby setup you like in particular. In general, Valby wants these substats in this priority order. Skill cooldown. This is the most important substat of them all because it allows her to hit breakpoints that make her mobility skill cooldown match the duration with 2 mods. It also allows ability DPS builds to match cooldown to duration with just 1 mod. Specifically on Moisture Supply max investment ability DPS builds, you can skip this to run skill crit rate and skill crit damage instead. 2. Skill duration. This is only needed for weapon platform builds and makes your first ability puddles and movement ability last longer. Skip this for ability DPS builds. Non-attribute skill power boost ratio. This is the biggest amplifier to all damage she deals on an ability DPS build. Mandatory if you go that route. Dimensional skill power boost ratio. This is the alternative if you don't have non-attribute skill power boost ratio. Just as good if you're DPSing with their third ability. Useless for first ability DPS. Fusion skill power boost ratio. This is the alternative if you don't have non-attribute skill power boost ratio again. Now this is just as good if you're DPSing with her first ability. And it's useless for third ability DPS. Okay, skill crit rate. This is only useful for max investment Supply Moisture ability DPS builds, because the skill module multiplies final crit chance on Valby by 5. This is a smaller damage buff than skill crit damage substat, but improves crit consistency. Skill crit damage. Again, only useful for max investment Supply Moisture ability DPS builds, because the skill module multiplies final crit chance, again as I said, by 5. It's a bigger damage buff than skill crit rate substat, but has slightly less crit consistency. Okay, so reactor substat min-maxing for each setup. If you're using a Moisture Supply weapon DPS mobbing build, skill cooldown, skill duration. If you're using Moisture Supply weapon DPS Colossi build, it is still skill cooldown and skill duration. Now, if you go Tidal Wave or Water Play ability DPS, which is lower investment, then skill cooldown and 1 of non-attribute skill power boost ratio or equivalent, being the dimensional or fusion, whichever one fits the bill. For Moisture Supply ability DPS nuke, note that this requires max investment, but it would be non-attribute skill power boost ratio or equivalent, and 1 of either skill crit damage or skill crit rate. For external components, this is pretty simple. Valby is not very tanky and thus will want defense main stat in all slots. Substats can be whatever you want, they're not that important here. For set effects, you have two choices. I will warn you that the gold weapon platform ones are not really worth it, and it's fine to not have it for now since it's not mandatory. Valby weapon platform does not have a proper gold external component set that specifically caters towards her playstyle. Now, if you're weapon platforming Valby with cold element DPS, then you can use the 4-piece Polar Knight from hard mode Dead Bride for the crit damage bonus. This works for anything high fire rate like SMGs, assault rifles, machine guns, etc. If you're using scouts and snipers instead, you can go with the Frostwalker set. You will not be able to activate the bonus part of the 4-piece set effect besides the skill cooldown, but you still get the 2-piece crit bonus. This is insanely annoying to farm though, so I honestly wouldn't recommend picking it up. For less annoying gearing, you can just use the purple Veteran Marksman Auxiliary Power set from normal mode Pyromaniac, as it applies to all Valby weapon choices and the crit rate is very desired due to moisture supply scaling. For gold rarity, I would recommend Slayer Auxiliary Power on an all-purpose Valby selection. For weapon platform, this grants extra general rounds and extra rounds in mag for quality of life, but doesn't bring any damage buffs. For the ability nuke build, Slayer perfectly complements her, granting 26.1% more skill power scaling, and if camping with ability DPS, you can proc Toad with her 4 in a doorway to get a free MP collector effect without needing to equip it. For weapon choices, it's pretty obvious. Valby can use anything in the game fine, because she turns all weapons into crit sticks on a weapon platform build. On an ability DPS build, your main choices are Thunder Cage or any high DPS tool. So why Thunder Cage specifically? Thunder Cage deals AoE electric damage with its unique trait when you kill enemies. Valby has a somewhat clunky grouping ability, good for doorway camping in harder encounters, that also debuffs enemies to electric damage. That's why Thunder Cage is a signature weapon. Now, for any weapon you bring on Valby, you don't have to mod it special, but include electric if you have a spare slot. Lower investment weapons will not have space to fit electric as it isn't worth a DPS. If you aren't using Supply Moisture, crit mods are only worth it if the weapon has 20% base crit rate or higher. If you are using Supply Moisture, any weapon that has 10% crit rate or higher can use crit mods. If using Supply Moisture, all weapons on Valby will want Firearm Attack, crit rate, and crit damage substats. The last slot can be element damage or weak point damage. Bossing prefers weak point damage or colossi damage. If you aren't using Supply Moisture, crit substats are only worth it if the weapon has 20% crit rate or higher innately. Now, this is what my sample 1 activator, 0 catalyst Thunder Cage looks like. I'll give advice off of a 0 catalyst build first. It consistently puts out 60k crits on her and 160k crit headshots. It sprays bodies for 10 to 15k non-crit. Action and reaction is the strongest firearm attack percent mod you can slot, so we bring it. The recoil is fine, so don't worry. Concentration priority is the strongest crit damage mod for white ammo, so always use it. The reload penalty is fine, because the SMGs reload fast and the crit damage stat is too big to ignore. This Thunder Cage reaches 35% crit rate overall with this build, which is doubled to 70% when standing on water puddles with Supply Moisture. You don't need fire rate on Thunder Cage because that increases recoil, spread, and ammo consumption, and it has a habit of overkilling against mobs. SMGs already shoot fast enough. On a higher investment build, 2 weak point mods go in these slots. The reason why I didn't use them is it's actually weaker than crit. One of the bottom mod slots is for elementals, preferably electric for the laundry debuff, so long as enemies don't resist electric. The other slot is quality of life. You can pick more damage or reload speed or bigger mag. Electric conductor is very good here when enemies allow it due to SMGs applying statuses easily with their high fire rate. Scout rifles, Valby also works well with too. With 1 energy activator but 0 catalyst, there is just enough in 80 capacity to fit all 5 of these mods at max rank. Each costs 16 cap. Make sure you have the weak point expansion mod. Now, this mod is misleading. The mod does not go on cooldown if the shot kills the enemy. However, killing an enemy will not reset the mod if it is already on cooldown. Meaning, if there are 5 enemies you can kill in 1 headshot each, then you can now proc this mod back to back all 5 times. As soon as you fail to kill on a weak point hit, it will go on cooldown like normal. Headshots are considered weak points on non-colossi as well, so this is a massive damage buff, allowing you to one-shot most enemies instantly. I already passed 500k plus damage on this Zero Catalyst build when I land headshot crits. With a Catalyst, Silly Weeper can easily surpass 1 million damage and get into even 2 million plus damage territory per shot. At higher investment, you will dedicate 4 mod slots to crit rate and crit damage using both blues and then 2 of the highest scaling purples. We don't use concentration priority on scouts because they already have slow reload. I opted for Fatal Critical as my purple crit damage mod. We fit another purple weak point mod for anything that lives the first shot, like zone bosses and Colossi. The last slot is flex speed for elementals on Valby, like electric enhancement, or quality of life like faster reload speed or bigger magazine. For a Tamer build, if you're using it with Valby, it would uniquely be modded, like this. It is pretty similar to how I set up my Thunder Cage. Uniquely, sniper rifles can reach 100% crit rate with supply moisture by achieving roughly 65 to 70% crit rate before supply moisture applies. Afterglow swords specifically can reach 62.5% crit rate without mods because of its passive, letting you completely skip modding crit chance entirely on Valby on an Afterglow setup, focusing on even more crit damage or quality of life stuff like magazine size, fire rate, or reload speed, or more elementals. You can extrapolate based off of these builds on how to set up other weapon builds. As a reminder, Valby's supply moisture doubles the final crit rate value of scout rifles and SMGs, but triples the final crit rate of certain weapons, for example like Tamer, making crit Tamer an absolute monstrosity. You can double check my findings on Valby weapons in the attached spreadsheet in description and pinned comment. Thank you so much for checking out my complete Valby guide today. Hopefully this video has helped you understand the nuances on Valby and why she's such a good Descendant. If you have any questions, do feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll be actively streaming this game almost every day, so you might be able to get your question answered sooner if you ask me while I'm live. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos on a nearly daily basis. You don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.